You're good? Okay. Good evening, everyone. And I apologize if it's a little bit more informal than usual. We're coming to you live from the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. I'm Ricardo Alfaro, Chair of Agenda Alexandria. And I want to thank, first and foremost, everyone here tonight for taking the time to come in person. This is kind of like when you haven't done a bike ride in a while. You're kind of like getting back to things, and you're like, oh, that detail here, that detail there, and want to make sure that the audio is right, and want to make sure the video is right. And now we're also trying doing this via live stream. So I really appreciate everyone's patience here, and I appreciate everyone's patience online as well. I want to start off, before starting with the program, to give, so Agenda, I did realize this, but Agenda has been using this service called Restream.io. And we've been using Restream.io to multicast to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube since the start of the season. And actually, as a matter of fact, last season we used it too. I learned over the weekend that Restream.io was created by 2 Ukrainians, and that a lot of their staff was based in Ukraine before having to obviously leave the country because of the ongoing crisis. So I wanted to start off tonight by thanking not just the engineers and people behind Restream.io to make this live stream multicast possible, but also to let everyone know that we're with you and that we hope for the best in this ongoing conflict that is happening over there. Thank you. So tonight's program is very timely and very important to Agenda. And before we go on, I don't know what happened to my mic. It's all good up there? Okay. I want to thank our presenting sponsors, McInerney & Associates, Simpson Development, the Zebra. I want to thank, there's a lot of sustaining members, so please bear with me, which, by the way, if you are not if you're not a sustaining member yet, please go to agendaalexandria.org and consider becoming a sustaining member. Eileen Ahern, Linda and Steve App, David Baker, Janet Barnett, Henry Brooks, Nick Carosi, Lee Carosi Dunn, Bill Dickinson, Frank Fannin, Jeannie Franco, Chris Lewis, Mary Harris, Val Hawkins, Rod Kukro, Michael Pope, Ann B. Rector, Elizabeth Seltzer, David Speck, and Pat Torkas. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to all of you and all the contributors and people who really care about Agenda and care about our community. So again, I really bear with us tonight. This will feel a little bit more informal than usual. We have one of the panelists is joining us via Zoom. Last month we were very successful in having someone via Zoom for our last program, but we didn't have an in-person audience. So please bear with us. And with that, Nick, whenever you're ready, please roll the intro.
Good evening, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and those who are joining us online. My name is Chris Lewis. I'm your moderator for the evening, and our topic today is one that when we met as an Agenda Alexandria board to come up with topics for this year, I think we spent the most time on this one. Our topic, we call this hour that we're going to spend, we call it Experiences in Race, Storytelling in a Judgment-Free Zone. And I want to thank my co-organizers, Ginny Franco and Janet Barnett, for helping organize this panel and this discussion. And we do want it to be a discussion. Just a few notes about the topic and the discussion we're going to talk about when it comes to race and race equity and all the stuff happening, but focusing on Alexandria. When we talked as a group and we have this wonderful panel with us, we agreed that we wanted to have a dialogue, not a debate. And sometimes we have debates here at Agenda Alexandria, but this is a long-standing and ongoing topic around race. And so we wanted to make sure we have a dialogue. We wanted to be aware of the idea that we have a wonderful, diverse panel. Not everyone comes to this issue from the same place or from the same perspective. And so there may be moments or perspectives that you don't agree with, or that I think we called them ouch moments when we were talking. But we expect that, but we still think it's an important dialogue to have. And third, that we only have an hour. And so none of us expect that we're going to solve racial issues in an hour, but we do hope that it can be a lesson in how we talk about issues in Alexandria, especially issues of race, and hopefully folks can take it and move it forward on their own after this event. So we hope we're helpful in that way. So with that, I want to thank our panelists for joining us. We've got 5 wonderful people here, and let me introduce them, and then we'll go to our discussion. But don't forget, you can pass in questions. Hopefully everyone in the audience has sticky notes, and you can pass them to Ricardo or others, and I'll get those, and we can add your questions to the discussion. Our panelists, starting on the other end, we have Vaughn Ambrose, who is a teacher, a performing artist, and an entrepreneur. Next to him, we have Frank Fannin, a former city council member here in Alexandria and a businessman. We also have next to him, Miss Rosa Bird, who is a community activist and a living legend here in Alexandria. I left out Frank. I should also note Frank is also a former board member of Agenda Alexandria, which is always important for us to note. So thank you, Frank, for helping us. And then next to me, we have Fernando Torres, who is an entrepreneur here in town, as well as an Air Force veteran. Thank you, Fernando. And then online on the screen behind us, we have Whitney Parnell, who works as a racial equity and allyship facilitator. And so we're going to come back to Whitney, but I wanted to start with our 4 folks in person here, because since this is called storytelling on experiences in race, we've asked each of our folks, and maybe we can just go down the line, starting with Vaughn, to tell us a brief story. So I'll ask you guys, when you think about race in Alexandria, what's the most prominent personal story or experience that you think of? And give us a few minutes.
Good evening. My name is Vaughn Ambrose, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I have 2 short stories I'd like to share. The first story, as a performer, it's always been very important to me to have the opportunity to perform in the community in which I live. And working through Alexandria City and turning in applications to be a part of some of the concerts that are sponsored by the city, whenever I would turn my paperwork in, I would always, when I was chosen, the budget for my group was only $100 to run the entire 2 or 3 hour performance. And I found out several years into it from one of my fellow musicians, who actually happens to be a white musician, that when he's contacted or was contacted by the city, he got his normal fee for the entire ensemble. So it really struck me that in the community in which I live in, I wasn't seen on equal par with the other performers in the area. The other story that I'd like to share, as a parent of or several students in the school system, we were having a discussion with my son's teacher, and my kids are of mixed race. And when we were having the conversation, I found that the teachers spent more time discussing my son's progress with his mom than to me. And when they turned to speak to me, they found it, or took it upon themselves to kind of break down the vocabulary and use smaller words and use more gestures to explain what was going on in the class. Of course, it was very offensive, because I'm too in the field of education and have multiple degrees in education. But at that moment, I was spoken down to as if I weren't able to comprehend the concepts they were speaking of and what my son was dealing with at that time.
All right, Frank?
Chris, thanks for having us here, and I think this is going to be a great discussion. And as Chris mentioned, everybody comes from different backgrounds and has different experiences. And Rose is the only one on the panel here that went to segregated schools. So I grew up here in Alexandria. I went to public high school, Groveton, West Potomac, down the road here. I always didn't really view race as an issue until a couple years ago. And this is true with a lot of white people. I'm 53 years old. I played high school basketball. We had nine African Americans on the team, a Korean and American Indian. We all got along. Everything was great. And I remember in high school when 1988, first year out of high school, Doug Williams, he went to the Super Bowl, led the Redskins to the Super Bowl. Everybody said, "What's it like to be the first black quarterback?" He says, "I'm not a black quarterback. I'm a quarterback." And in 1989, Virginia was the first state in the country to elect an African-American governor with Governor Wilder. So a lot of the things that we've heard and seen in the last couple of years have really sort of been eye-opening, and I love participating in these discussions and learning a little bit more. And one of the stories I remember when I was on the city council, I was trying to help some young fellas get set up with the Seaports Foundation, some teenagers, on an internship. And I was talking with one of their mothers, and I said, well, they can go down to the river by Cameron Street, and that's where they can go for the interview. And they said, well, they don't go down there. I go, who doesn't go down where? And she explained to me that this was her perspective. This wasn't, I don't think white people were telling her this, but her perspective was that black children shouldn't be going into Old Town. And that kind of, took me me by surprise. So that was a big eye-opener. And then, I thought this was behind us. Then when Earl Cook became the police chief, Earl's a wonderful guy, but every time we would go to a meeting, they'd say, the first black police chief in Alexandria. And so, none of this was on my radar, so those were just a couple instances that opened my eyes, and want to hear from Rosa.
Thank you. I'm Rosa Bird, and I sort of had to change my story to two really short stories. The first thing that comes to my mind when we're talking about race issues, it was when the Alexandria School Board was trying to make the custodians, let me go back, I'm going to read rather than talk. I was asked to select an item that was that I was aware of racial differences. What came to my mind was when the Alexandria School Board in 2019, regarding the employment of custodians, the budget proposed to change the custodians from being on the Alexandria City School payroll to subcontractors. The proposal was to be sure that I'm sorry, I have to start over. The proposal was said to be an efficient way of securing custodial service, but it left many of us with unanswered questions. Would custodians who had been working for the schools for many years lose their job security? What kind of benefits would they have under this new arrangement? What about their pensions? Could the subcontracting agency really be trusted to look out for their interests? When this decision was made, it was not racist, but it was to help the city council, the school board. I'm doing this terrible job here, I'm sorry. Because I've been practiced reading this, so here we go. When the decision about whether or not to move the custodians to a contracting arrangement was put before the school board and then city council, it was never described or talked about race. But we knew that most of the school custodians were black or Hispanic, so the outcome of it would have a racial effect. I feel strongly about this because I am personally familiar with injustice of people being taken advantage of in their work situation. Frank said I'm the one that came from a segregated school. We live in Halifax County where sharecroppers down near North Carolina. Our family grew tobacco on land owned by a white man. And every season, we had to give 50% of our crops income to the landowner. That was part of the sharecropping agreement. What's more, we had to buy seed, fertilizer, and other supplies from the landowner's store. We had no way of knowing whether we were being charged a fair price for these things or not. But we did know the interest rate on the store charge for it was excessive. Our family and many other sharecroppers in the South, they went by this same system.
Thank you, Rosa.
Fernando.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Fernando Torres, and I'd like to thank Agenda, Chris, and all the board members of Agenda Alexandria as well for this platform. I'm an immigrant. I came from Bolivia when I was 12. Luckily, I know English very fluently. I knew how to say what's my name and how old I was. But thanks to my parents, now my mom, we came to this country to make the best out of ourselves. I believe this country has its flaws, but it has many, many ups over any other dark day. So as soon as I got interested in the military, I jumped into don't hit me for this, into the smartest branch in the world. See, he knows. The Air Force. So the U.S. Air Force showed me great things. I traveled all over the world. But unfortunately, I did have an incident that my first year in the military, I did run into someone that believed that was better than me, and unfortunately, we handle things the way we kind of handle things in the military, which was not in a verbal way. However, I was 18 years old, and that was my first time that I was engaging with someone at that level. I didn't know what discrimination or racism or cancer was in Bolivia. Then I had to pay more attention to how things were, and the biggest thing that I've learned throughout my life was the following. I was active duty for 10 years. I'm a combat veteran, all three wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Horns of Africa. At any given time, no matter what color, where you're from, whatever mentality or region you came from, we were one team. Unless you were Army or Air Force or, you know. But all jokes aside, we were all, if we were out there, we knew we had each other's back because, you know, it mattered. However, when I got out of the service, it was a huge problem coming over to Alexandria, setting up a business, because not only was I structured to follow a very rigid, square-like protocol, but it was also an issue of, well, I'm a minority, not just because of the way I talk or the way I look, but also because in Old Town, technology was also a problem. So I do want to share that the biggest obstacle that I faced was in the military. It wasn't an issue. It was very seldom, if any. Once I got out of the military, I had to deal with a few of these obstacles, and I think that's where, and I'm going to set it up very nicely for Chris here, I think that's where the systemic issue arises, because we don't see us as one. Nowadays, we see us with color, height. If you're handicapped, you get discriminated also if you're handicapped or challenged. So, my 2 cents, Chris.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, each of you, for your stories. And before we kind of open it up to everyone on the panel with more questions, I want to turn to Whitney. Whitney, thank you for joining us virtually. And so, you know, you've had a chance to listen to some of our storytellers' stories. And as I'm listening, and you and I, we're all hearing these for the first time, I hear I hear stories about assumptions that people make. I hear stories about systems. I hear stories about how different decisions impact people. Norms, like Frank said, someone thought someone could or could not go to a certain part of town. So Whitney, we've been talking about race in this country, and certainly in Alexandria too, for so long. But when we have talked about it in the last few years, we hear a lot of terms that some folks understand and some folks don't understand. Terms like systemic racism, terms like whiteness, terms like white privilege. I want to ask you to define those three terms for us. So take some time to do that. And then I also ask you, maybe why do you think, given the long discussion around race in our country, that those terms are new to many folks?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, everyone. My name is Whitney. My pronouns are she, her. I want to acknowledge I'm currently on Muskogee land. That's why I'm grateful that you all were willing to be adaptable for me to show up virtually, because I do reside in what is historically Piscataway land and currently Alexandria. So I'm really grateful to be with you all this evening. Thank you, Chris, for that ask. I'll say usually, I do days-long trainings, really trying to break that down. And so the way that I'll try to handle it is in a particular order, which I'll have to go by whiteness, systemic racism, and then white privilege in condensed fashion. And so I think that the quote that really sets us up well for it was said by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is that race is the child of racism, not the father. That has so many implications, because in order to understand systemic racism, we have to be able to understand white supremacy. And to be clear, not white supremacists, not white nationalists, not the KKK, but the way that I like to define white supremacy is the institutionalization of white dominance and power. And so that's just so important to name, because history is so critical, and we've got to understand the history of the term whiteness. Whiteness was a specific construct that was about curating and creating power for people with European descent. So you can learn history and look at documentation of how it continued to be evolved and curated from the late 1600s as a way to galvanize people of European descent, saying, opt into this thing called whiteness for power. Evolved some more in the late 1700s when it came to saying, if you are white, you have the right to vote. So I do want to name, naming whiteness as a construct is not meant as an attack, it's to understand history. And that today its evolution is really understanding that history of power and dominance and how that's been incorporated as culture. Because people of European descent having that power then got to deem the default of societal norms. So when you talk about whiteness, it's this really complicated thing now that refers to the way that white people, their customs, their culture, their beliefs operate at the standard. And so that's just like a snapshot of whiteness to really understand that there was a construct there that has historic basis that now is this combination of understanding power and culture. And so, like I said, white supremacy is the institutionalization of white dominance and power. So I'd like to describe racism as the structural upholding of white supremacy. So racism was constructed to uphold this thing called white supremacy. And so I know that that can get such a reaction from people. So I always invite people to think about systemic racism as this iceberg. Race equity practitioners love icebergs. I'm being 0% unique right now. We love iceberg symbolism, because imagine when you see an iceberg, right? There's just the tip, and then below the surface is the brunt of the iceberg. And so I think a lot of people respond so much to racism and claims of racism because they're thinking about the tip, where a lot of people have been raised hearing, you see that? That's racism. Racism is done by bad people who see white people as superior, Black, Indigenous, and people of color as inferior, intentionally want to keep white people in power. Like there's a whole association of racism applying to character and intention and superiority complex, when really that's just the tip. I invite people to think about the fullness of racism being all that's below the surface. And systemic racism can be complicated. So what I invite people to think about is the fact that there are 4 prongs of racism. There's the individual. That's the stuff that's in us. Data shows all of us have racial bias. So individual racism is how that manifests as harmful beliefs and attitudes. There's the interpersonal, and this is the harm that we cause others. That I always tell people, don't just think about interpersonal racism as the hate crime. Think about things like the microaggressions, which are proven to literally impact people's physical and mental health. Then there's the institutional, and this is how this power is upheld through organized space. And I always say, when you think about institutional racism, don't just think large institutions like law, government. Your workplace is an institution. Your faith-based setting is an institution. And so I like to say the interplay between all 3 of these things compound on each other to create that iceberg. That's why sometimes people will say structural racism to speak to that compounding. But I actually use systemic to speak to this interplay happening, where I talk with my hands a lot. If you think about the interplay between individual, interpersonal, institutional interplaying, it's creating this energy that continues happening even when we're not touching it. And so you think about how systemic racism manifests as things like Black women dying at 3 to 4 times more likely to die at 3 to 4 times likely in childbirth, regardless of socioeconomic status or health background. You think about the criminal legal system that disproportionately has excessive force, arrest, and imprisons Black, brown, and Native folks. You think about that racial wealth gap, which is actually growing with time. That with time, that racial wealth gap is growing. So when we understand these different prongs of racism and how their interplay create that energy is what is systemic racism. So that's why I say that racism structurally upholds this thing called white supremacy, which interplays with that construct of whiteness. And so I leave you with, hence white privilege is not speaking to anyone's character or anyone's lack of work ethic, but rather recognizing that by default, having white skin affords certain opportunities that Black, Indigenous, and people of color do not have, and also involves what people don't have to worry about, what white people don't have to worry about facing. White privilege does not mean that white people haven't struggled, don't have their own things to face, but it does mean recognizing that the world has been systemic, or society has been systemically constructed in a way that benefits white people, and in a way that allows white people to not have to deal with challenges due to their race that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color I refer to as BIPOC deal with. So that's your 4-minute snapshot of whiteness, systemic racism, and hence white privilege. And I look forward to discussing more as a group.
First of all, that was impressive because I've seen Whitney do hours-long trainings, and she compressed a lot of stuff there for us. And so, again, if folks have questions, please pass them up, and hopefully we can break some of that down if folks have questions about that. So I want to involve the whole group now, because those definitions were interesting, especially coming after the stories that we had. And so I want to ask all of you, as we think about Alexandria and some of these terms like white privilege or systemic racism, maybe I'll try white privilege as a term. When you think of white privilege in Alexandria, what do you think of, or do you not think of it? I'm just curious how folks react to the definition that she was giving, but also how you think of it when you think of it in Alexandria. So, I don't know if Vaughn or someone else.
Sure. When I think of white privilege in the city of Alexandria, I have to look at my sons and the conversations that I have to have with them in order for them to be safe. I have to not allow them to simply grow up as young people free of fear and having to basically take their innocence away, because I have 3 young men, believe it or not, or 2 young men who are over 6 feet tall. If you look at me, you probably wonder where that comes from. but I have to talk to them about how they stand and what they do with their hands when they're approached by law enforcement. A conversation that I know my white counterparts don't have to have with their sons. To me,
The talk.
yes.
Yes.
And that's a form of white privilege that they're afforded the benefit, that their sons will always be afforded the benefit of the doubt. My son doesn't receive that. And to me, that's huge. That's a huge privilege. If we want to talk about housing, I know what it was, the process of trying to obtain a loan to purchase a home in the city of the hoops that I had to jump through. And in doing that, we sold our home to some folks who were immigrants. And I saw the interest rate that they got, and I was like, that's unreal. So I can see that it's rough for me, but then I see really how rough it is for those individuals who are new to the country, and that the white privilege, they don't have to experience those things.
Other reactions to white privilege?
I mean, one of the thoughts is, you know, we live in one of the biggest melting pots in America here in Alexandria. 25% of the people that live in Alexandria were born outside the United States. We have approximately 70 different ethnicities at T.C. Williams. And as we go forward over time, I think a lot of these issues that we're talking about today will take care of themselves over the next couple decades and generations as the country becomes more integrated. Because right now there's 74 million children in America under 18. As of last year, the majority of those children are non-white now. And multiracial marriages have increased 3 times in the last 35 years. So this is going to continue to grow where, you know, back in the day, the Irish married the Irish, the Italians married the Italian, and if Irish married Italian, it was a big controversy. And right now we have many different ethnicities marrying each other, and so, you know, people just aren't necessarily black and white right now. And one of the other things when they talk about racism, there's another side to this, to reverse racism, which I've seen it happen here in Alexandria. I have friends that have white kids that got 4.3% GPAs at T.C. Williams, and they didn't get into the University of Virginia because there were racial quotas, and maybe a black woman got in there who wasn't as academically qualified. And just last week, you saw what happened. The judge ruled that the admittance at TJ, Thomas Jefferson, was illegal because it discriminated against Asian Americans. They tried to change the policy to get more minorities in there or African American students, and it was shot down. And we'll see what happens with the Supreme Court that's going to rule in June the future of affirmative action. So a lot of people look at it as just as against African American folks, but there's also a lot of white people look at it differently. And a lot of people really took what President Biden did as very racist when he came out and said that we're going to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court. So basically, it wasn't who was the best legal mind, it eliminated 94% of the population. So this is the other side that people need to consider.
Other reactions to white privilege?
The only thing that I would like to say is the gentrification in housing in Alexandria, because the neighborhoods that at one time black people could afford to live there, but because of the changes in this city and even our neighborhood, when I moved in my neighborhood, it was 99% white. Then it went 99% black, and now it's back to 99% white because most of the people that I know cannot afford to live in that neighborhood.
Well, I guess it's my turn to bring out the, I don't know which hat I'm gonna wear, the military or the immigrant, but you know, what Frank has said right now, it's unfortunately very sad, and I've tried to not be part of that mentality, which is the reverse racism. That's yeah. My first encounter on that was simply because I was Latino. And my approach, the way I was approached, I think it was also for a platform, a discussion, more or less like this. And it was not necessarily about tonight's subject, but it was completely, I believe it was because of technology. And I was approached because I was Latino, and I said, okay, I guess that's just what it is. But then what really upset me was they approached me in Spanish, like I didn't speak English. I know my English is not the greatest, but it was sad. It was sad to see that. I keep hearing white racism, whitewash, and all these terms, but honestly, if we're gonna paint a color, what happens when you're discriminated against or you deal with racism from a black person? We cannot, in today's society, we cannot talk about that. It's always white to black. And we are just, the Latino community, we're just phased out. That's one. I'm sure, remind me your name again. But I'm sure, like he mentioned, us immigrants, when we come here, I have something that I always tell, that I always share with everybody. I'm like, hey, this is like you guys have the talk. I say this is the typical immigrant story. You may be a doctor overseas, but guess what? You're coming over here and installing carpets. You're cleaning windows. You're doing catering. And you may have been making $50,000, $100,000 in your country, but here, guess what? You're making $12 an hour. So I think it's very important to also address not just white this, white that, black this, black that, but in reality is when you are trying to address and bring someone because of their color, bring someone up because of their color and not because of their merit, guess what? That's creating racism. You are the source of the dispute that we're having. So I think what I would like to do with tonight's platform is at any level I can discuss with anyone here. Why? Because I'm not just an immigrant. I've also married a European, beautiful blonde woman, and she was born in Poland. So I understand how that also goes. So I think we should, if we're trying to make this an eventful night so we all can learn from each other and then learn how to address other cultures, it's not just a color.
So, well, hold on before we come to Yvonne. Number one, I said, folks aren't going to agree with everything that's said. So one ouch moment that came from the audience, I was asked to correct the name of the high school, which has been changed from T.C. Williams to Alexandria City High School. So I will just note that came in from the audience. So thank you, audience. I was going to go to Whitney next, but do you have something to add, Vaughn?
Yes. When we're discussing quotas in reverse racism, I think what's lost is that the individuals of color who are being chosen are quite qualified. It's not like these individuals haven't done the work themselves. And I think it's very unfair to point to one incident or to say that is a true representation of the entire experience. I know personal experience, I am quite qualified. I'm sure Mr. Lewis here at the end is quite qualified. So wherever we landed in school and where we landed in our careers, I know that I was qualified enough to have the job. And I think when we start looking at the reverse racism, then we're still looking at it through a superior lens, as in the people of color aren't superior enough to be in that setting. So that's why we're taking something from someone else. But when those individuals more than likely have definitely earned the opportunity, and I'm not going to say that's 100% of the time, but that is there. So these individuals that are chosen, if a Supreme Court justice is chosen and who happens to be a woman of color, I'm sure that individual, hopefully, was number one in their class and has served the country in a federal, in some type of federal capacity. It's not someone that they just picked up off the street. I think that's where we kind of get lost, because it's always like we have to give up something or lose something in order to get equity and equality.
The audience is great. I'm piled up with questions here from the audience, but I want to turn to Whitney because we've had some good reactions here to white privilege, and we've heard other terms as well. Particularly the reverse racism question. So, we have one question from the audience that asks, how do you assume that you were paid less because of your race? Or, do you know, or do you assume, and how do you know? There was, Frank was talking about, when choices are made, and how he believes it can be reverse racism. When I think of some of the stuff I've read about people who, if you've read Ibram X. Kendi, who talks about anti-racism, he's of the perspective that in order to correct systemic racism, you actually have to discriminate in the opposite direction. I may be paraphrasing him wrong, but is that reverse racism, or is that correction of a system? So I want to turn to Whitney. And Whitney, how do you think about, as someone who studies this stuff, the idea of dealing with these systemic issues when folks feel like it may be discriminatory against them?
Thank you, Chris. It has definitely been an informing conversation that I appreciate everybody showing up to courageously. And so I have 3 buckets of reaction that I want to handle with care and also with brevity. And so the first one being turning around to your question about, is there white privilege and how does it show up? I so appreciate people's personal experiences named, because it's often a thing that Black, Indigenous, people of color's experiences aren't taken seriously, when that is why it matters, right? How it impacts people. But I want to throw some data on top of that and throw that by kindergarten, kids in schools deem that the best way to be is white. And that's because some of the biggest things that impact people's racial bias is media, and all the media around us that is unconsciously informing us. And in schools, hubs of demonizing, criminalizing Black, brown people, lifting up white students. So it just goes to show that if by age 5, the world is telling kids that the best way to be is white, that is saying something about white privilege, right? The second piece being, I do need to address reverse racism, because from my perspective, that is not in existence. I want to be clear that certainly we all have racial bias that we can certainly act on, right? But I want to come back to, that's why it's so important to understand that the term racism is specifically what upholds white supremacy. And literally thinking about centuries worth of that curation, there is literally no way to do a flip so that is reversed systemically in terms of the impact on white people. It's just not possible to do that. So reverse racism, I actually find to be very harmful, because it's an attack on trying to do race equity, right? Like when you talk about affirmative action, easily the numbers show that white women have actually benefited most from affirmative action. So it's an example of that when you try to address racism, which is literally impacts every single institution, by default, that will allow you to work towards everybody's liberation and everybody's thriving. So reverse racism just is not real. And furthermore, efforts of equity by no means are doing a flip so that white people will experience harm by default. I also do want to acknowledge too that this work towards race equity is for everybody's liberation. And I certainly want to acknowledge the point that when we talk about racism, it needs to involve all races, and that I certainly acknowledge people feeling neglected from that conversation. Though I also want to acknowledge that it's important to understand anti-Blackness, because it's the other sided coin of white supremacy. So by understanding the two and anti-Blackness as the bedrock, that allows us to really understand the fullness of racial oppression. But we certainly need to make sure that in our efforts of race equity, we include all of our siblings of color, for sure, right? So what I'll end with is that race equity, the way that I like to put it, is a world in which race does not impact anybody's ability to thrive. And all the data furthermore shows that if we are working not to be racist, if everybody were just hands off, given the systemic nature of what has been institutionalized for centuries, the data shows that actually racism will just continue and grow get more broad. So I actually disagree with the premise that things will just work themselves out with time, because certainly proximity and community makes a huge difference. It is so important. But to your point about quoting Ibram X. Kendi, that we have to actively be anti-racist, if we're not actively trying to address racism and work towards race equity, then the data shows that racism will just get more broadly, to the example of discrimination with housing, to the example of the racial wealth gap growing, to the example of COVID-19, right? And how BIPOC communities were more highly infected, died at higher rates, right? We actually really have to actively be anti-racist and actively work towards race equity, because if we're not, that energy will just continue. So those are some of my initial reactions, Chris. I don't even know if I answered your question, but I hope that it gave you something to move forward with.
All right. I'm going to try to get to some of what I've got from the audience here. There's two that are jumping out at me here. One of these, the audience member says, what are some solutions to the systemic racism in our community? That's a challenging question. I don't know if anyone wants to try and tackle that.
I think it starts with education. Those of us who have studied education, when you walk into Education 101, the first thing they start to discuss or to talk about is the achievement gap. So we're planting in the minds of every new teacher that there is already a gap between white and students of color. If we get rid of that alone, then every student walks into the school as being seen equal and will be taught on an equal playing field. But when a student walks in, you already say, well, that child I know is going to be behind two reading levels or math level, just because that's what we're being taught. It all starts with education. If we can, I shouldn't say it all starts with education, I take that back. Education is very important to achieving equity.
Schools should be teaching education, focusing on education.
Yes.
I completely agree with that. That's what a school's for. I didn't mean to jump on you.
No, jump in, come on.
Go ahead.
I think we should all of us arm ourselves with the truth and focus on just people. People make mistakes. People say things that sometimes they don't mean, but in reality is focusing on spearhead school. School is ground zero, outside of the parents, of course, your household. But a school is ground zero. I mean, I believe that's a very strong statement. I have little ones, so that's very personal to me, as it is to you and Frank as well. I believe schools should be focusing on teaching a subject matter, English, math, the basic core, the curriculum. Outside of that, I think it should be left at home, left at parents, for them to decide what the kids needs to do, whether they need to have the talk or the, excuse me for spitting, or the typical immigrant story, as I mentioned before. The way to fix it, don't take offense by it. If anything, educate that person. Quick anecdote. I made the mistake to go to Home Depot in an orange t-shirt. Hey, but I did it. I went out there, and unfortunately, there was a lady that she approached me and she said, she wasn't even being nice. She was like, hey, can you tell me where I can find this? And if it would have been a bad day for me, I would have 0 to 100 really quick. But, and I didn't look at the lady as a person of color, but I looked at myself and I said, well, I mean, genius I'm wearing orange. So if anything, I actually walked her and I showed her because I knew where the thing was. But I think that's what we also need to address ourselves, that sometimes we're too focused on the color, how big, how fat, how tall, the way you look. I think if we just come down to look into each other and say, hey, you are Chris, you're Rosa. I think that's where we need to start, and then take a step back and make sure that if someone does make a statement that is offensive to you, perhaps take that opportunity to challenge and educate the person if you're able to do so, and the person is open-minded to do so. If not, then there's always going to be bad apples. So at that point, you should just walk away. But don't look at a person based on color. Look at a person based on their merit, the way they look, your friend, and continue on with your life and educate others if you have the opportunity. Use a platform to educate others like this, which is what we're trying to do.
So Fernando brought up one of the other questions that was jumping out. Someone asked what critical race theory is, because it's been in the news. What does it really mean? And you even brought up, usually when people are talking about it, they're talking about what are we teaching in our schools? Are we just teaching math, or are we teaching history, and how are we teaching history? So we've got our professional facilitator here online. Whitney, tell us how you define critical race theory, and then maybe we can talk a bit about what we're teaching.
This may be my shortest answer yet. The critical race theory that everybody is fighting against in schools, I'm like, critical race theory was never being taught in schools. Critical race theory is a particular legal framework that is taught in grad school level courses. So students were never learning critical race theory in schools, and it's nothing that has ever been tried to be taught to 10-year-olds. What I think people are pushing back at is having to truth tell about history and the role that race played in the history of this country. Because that's been glossed over, and depending on where you are, you can not have to go so deeply into it. So when people try to use the term critical race theory, what they're really pushing back against is having to really acknowledge the role of race and tell the hard truth historically. That is not trying to hence attack white people and say that all white people are bad. And it's certainly not trying to actually implement the course study that is a grad school level type of course study. So what I always invite people to think about is understand what critical race theory actually is, which is a grad school level course, and to really push rather at what makes you so uncomfortable about having to study the history of race past to inform present. And I think that's really the conversation that we need to be having when it comes to all this pushback in schools.
So, no, I want to come to you, Frank, but let me frame this a bit more, because so she's given that definition, and let's compliment Alexandria. We haven't seen any sort of violence or crazy shouting that we see on the news in other places. We haven't seen that in Alexandria, but someone asked about critical race theory and what we're teaching in our schools. So. When Whitney talks about it being about people being uncomfortable with what's being taught or feeling bad about talking about race and history, Frank, how do you react to that? And do you broadly? I want to ask everybody, but I want to start with Frank.
Well, you can use a lot of different terms.
Should we worry about, or should we be worried about people feeling bad about what history tells us?
No, but what I think you're doing is you're hurting young people in this, and I'm going to give you a perfect example. A lot of kids that might be young, African Americans, they didn't really know that there was this big problem and they were being discriminated against and things like this. And what Whitney's business is out there is, are we making race relations in America better, or are they becoming worse? And maybe different people have different perspectives on this. And one of my perspectives is, I went to a college basketball game 10 days ago. You won't see this on TV because they don't show the national anthem on TV. What they did is they sang a song, and I said to someone, what's this? And they said, it's the Black National Anthem. I said, I didn't know there was a Black National Anthem. I thought we were one country, one people. So they played this song Then, all of a sudden, they played the national anthem, and half of the basketball team ran into the locker room. And then after the song was over, the basketball team came back, and to make up for it in the second half, there were so many upset fans that donate to this school. They played God Bless America in the second half of the game to make up for the black national anthem and half the team running off the court. And this is, I'm not even going to say the school because it's a prominent school, and the coach, he's totally confused. He doesn't know how to deal with it, and it's just a big issue. And so, you know, all these guys are, you got half the team in the locker room for the national anthem, half the team in the other. And, you know, decades ago, it used to be about obligation, responsibility, team, and country. And I think today, a lot of people are about what's my rights and what's my privileges, and it's about me. And, you know, America's not going to go forward unless we can all be one.
Go ahead, Rosa.
Okay, Frank, we haven't been one in a long, long time. I did not do a good job of telling my story here because I had a totally different accent. But when you say you didn't know there was an African-American lift every voice and sing, and when I'm sitting here beside you and you didn't know all these things were going on with us, you have to be, don't take offense for this, we're friends. You have to be,
Debate.
yes, you have to be blind, crippled, or crazy not to know what's been going on with this country. I'm 78 years old. And one of the things that make me sad, and I try to get to it in this story, I didn't know. I went to a school. I didn't know half of the things that happened in the history. So we can teach what happened in the history and let young people learn it, or we can have old, uneducated people, and we can have young, uneducated people. We need to know our history. I'm not mad with anyone that things happened years and years ago. The saddest thing for me is when I talk about the education that I got in that segregated school.
All right, we're running out of time, and we barely got through all our questions. So let me send us out on one. Let me send us out on one question. And I'll just remind folks, you know, we knew we were not going to solve anything in an hour, but we really started to get at some of the folks, things that I hope the community will continue to talk about, because you can tell we have folks in our community who have different perspectives on this. So let's go out on this one, guys. When we're talking about battling racism or dealing with racial issues in our community, where does the responsibility lie to do that? Does it reside with the individuals? You talked about, you know, the family, Fernando. Does it responsibility lie with certain groups of people? Does it rely with the government? How do you know, since we're still dealing with it, where does the responsibility lie?
So I'll jump in. You. If you change the world, how do you change the world? One step at a time. Thank you. You have the power to change the world. You have the power to change your government. You have the power to change your neighbor and your neighborhood. Now, what I mean your neighbor is you can move, right? That's what I mean. Yeah. But you can do it. It's upon yourself, and that's something that today's society, today's mentality, it's not there. It's all about, well, what can the government do for me? What happened to before? What can I do for this country? You know, that's why us immigrants came over here to this great nation, because we want to achieve the greatest potential that we can have. So it's not about the government. And I also want to make sure it's, to piggyback on what Frank said is, yes, if we're going to have a black anthem, then let's have a Latino anthem.
You have one, don't you?
Which one?
I don't know, but I hear it.
We might have to do a whole session. We might have to do a whole session on the song Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what it is and what it's about. I'm really out of time. So real quickly, if anyone else want to jump in on responsibility? Come on.
Responsibility does lie with the individual, but that individual must be educated. You can't sit and
Running out of time. Come on.
Sure. Person has to be educated. You can't sit and be offended because you didn't know something existed. It is your job as a person of the community to try to learn as much as you can about every individual in your community, not just one person in that community. As a student of color, I had to learn all of the history that had absolutely nothing to do with me. So how is it fair that I know all of America's history, quote unquote, minus people of color, and you get offended when we just talk about one or two things that a person of color has contributed, when we know that there has been many things contributed by people of color. So education will lead to not learning just about your people, but the people beside you. And ultimately, education leads us into political office so we can change policies, because that is the key. When you sit and you look at government, what does government look like? And that, to get to that point, you must be educated. You have to be able to read and develop policy. So it does come down to education, so you can create a policy that is truly equal and for the people, not one type of people, because today the policy is not equal to every person in this country.
All right, the audience is clapping. I wish we could spend a few more hours because this is fascinating, but we are out of time, and Ricardo's going to give me the hook. So let me just ask folks to thank our very bold panelists for participating tonight. Yes, thank you very much. This is not an easy topic to cover, and we appreciate them taking the time to do it honestly with each other. And with that, Ricardo, do you want to close this out?
So, am I good to go? Good? Okay. Can I yell? Okay, now I can hear. First and foremost, thank you again, and let's give another round of applause to our panelists tonight. I think this has been an extraordinary program. Again, I really want to thank everyone here for your patience tonight as we went through the technical logistics. So I really want to thank you all. I do want to recognize, before we end the night, let me make sure that I get everything right here. Councilwoman Aaliyah Gaskins, thank you. And former school board member Charles Wilson, thank you. And I do not only want to recognize that former and current board members here, but one thing that I failed to say at the beginning was that you all heard the intro music. Basically, for the people that are watching online, they see this video sequence where we show our presenting sponsors, we give the title. We actually have the composer up here on stage, Vaughn, of our theme song. So I wanted to recognize that. And with that, if the audio works correctly, let's roll the credits. Thank you, everyone, again.
This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history, Agenda Alexandria is here to shine a light. What makes the organization so successful is our people. The people who run it, our panelists, our moderators, and of course, our members. Agenda Alexandria is a member-funded organization, and we invite you to become one today by visiting agendaalexandria.org.